And finally, I'm looking at the concept of cultural salience, kind of like the popularity and celebrity of these softwares. So what really wins out in the end? Like, why is Hatsune Miku so popular compared to other versions of the software? And then what is important for people who use certain versions of the software? Like, why do they decide to use them? And as well as for the fans. So you have producers who are specifically using Hatsune Miku, for example, but why do the fans like that character? Why do they like that music versus other versions? So my lit review is extremely interdisciplinary and expansive. It ranges from everything from franchise and the culture industries to open source software communities, producage, as I said before, with peer production. I'm looking at social media and platform politics, as well as globalization, Japanese subculture, literature, and specifically in detail more like idols and celebrity in Japan. My methods range from digital archiving, so going out and looking at the various media that appear on social networking sites and stuff like that, as well as online communities. And I call it archiving, which is true, but it's weird because I'm looking only at a few years out from now. I'm mainly focused on active network theory, which if you don't know from academia, is basically mapping out the networks between people and these media objects that emerge from communication between people. And then finally, my main focus is on ethnography. So basically I do a lot of interviews and participant observation as well. So let's start with the first idea, open source. So Lawrence Lessig, the famous IP professor and lawyer, has this idea called hybrid economies. And basically he wrote this book called Free Culture back in the early 2000s. And he said that there's this concept of sharing and being able to do what we want with information and media. And then he realized over time that that wasn't necessarily true. There were barriers like copyright and companies that get in the way. And so he tried to propose this new idea of hybrid economies, which are basically the opportunity for proprietary and money-making companies to use these ideas of free and open sharing and free, kind of like free software is the big example nowadays. Wikipedia is another one. But basically he says that either a commercial entity that aims to leverage value from a sharing economy, or a sharing economy that builds a commercial entity to better support sharing aims. And this is really Vocaloid in its most core form. The paradigm, of course, is free software, and then other examples of this hybrid are things like Craigslist, Flickr, YouTube, Slashdot, and things like that. The thing, though, is that this really conflicts with free software. So Vocaloid as a franchise is not just free. People aren't putting their songs for free online and that's it. They're also trying to make money off of their creative efforts. So there are really interesting things going on around IP and copyright. So for example, a lot of popularity around Vocaloid is actually through karaoke in Japan. And there are efforts to partner with Jazzrock, which is kind of the Japanese ASCAP, if you know the music industry around here. It basically helps litigate music licenses. And they're helping Vocaloid producers to kind of figure out a new way to license their music so that they can allow it to be shared and remixed online for free, but at the same time make some money back from it in the end. This is an image actually from the presentation yesterday. I thought it was so good I would use it. This explains the media mix system, the relationship between actors and producers and consumers within this whole ecosystem around the Vocaloid franchise. And this is basically the ecosystem of sharing according to Krypton as a business. And business is really key here. So you'll see that at various points, especially on the left side, coming out from Krypton, there's this keyword license. And licenses are really important to collaboration here. It's really the key. Because this is moral economy being built up around the pure production in this digital creative industry. But at the same time, there's a moral economy that emerges where fans are kind of capitulating to each other, saying that, oh, thank you for sharing this, I'm going to remix this, so I'm going to give you credit where credit is due. Now, all of this is occurring on social media sites, but it's really interesting because away from Nico Nico Doga and YouTube, which are kind of where people put up their videos to get popularity, Krypton has actually created a specific site dedicated to that kind of sharing initiative. So their website is Piapro, which is basically a shortened version in Japanese of the term peer production. And they also made a music site to help with licensing and selling music on Amazon, as well as iTunes, called Current. And basically, Pia Pro has more than 450,000 pieces of content on it already. And this ranges from illustrations, music, lyrics, etc. And peer production is basically facilitated through this site. The important thing to note, though, is that they have a license, and I'm going to get to the license in the next slide, and that's kind of the key to the sharing relationship. So the Pia Pro character license is what you basically have to, quote-unquote, like sign and accept to participate in this sharing economy. And it basically is the same thing as like a terms of service, end-user license agreement, and it kind of flows in the same way as a Creative Commons copyright license. So if you know what that is, it's basically like you kind of rethink copyright to be able to share things more freely. And so Yamaha on their website say that yes, it's totally fine to make money off of using our Vocaloid engine, but using the Vocaloid software from different companies is a bit different as well. And Japanese copyright is obviously regulated by the Berne Convention, which is an international copyright agreement. And so it's actually illegal in Japan to make derivative works, even though doujin works, kind of like amateur fan works, although they are also somewhat professional at the same time. There's this kind of like silent agreement to let these works emerge from the ordinary top-down producer-consumer relationship. And so the Pia Pro character license is really interesting because it depends really primarily on two concepts. The first is Niji Sosaku, which is derivative works, which I just mentioned, and then Hieri, which is non-commercial uses of the media. And so basically there are these kind of like rules that you have to follow when you use this website, which are basically that you like have to recognize the author of the works and that you have to link back to the page that they create on the Pia Pro website. And of course copyright isn't gone though, so some Vocaloid songs, as I mentioned before, are registered with JASRAC, but they are not necessarily, or everyone is not necessarily doing it, so that there are these kind of weird relationships going on around that. And of course it's not quite the GPL, which is the GNU Public License, which was released by Richard Stallman to regulate free and open source software. So it's kind of like creating this new economy, which is very different, but also very confusing at the same time. And then there's also the issue of what is not allowed. In the actual rules in this license, they state that you cannot, quote unquote, undermine the image of characters on their products. And you can't create media that is, quote unquote, contrary to public order. So you'll see in the media nowadays that there's like lots of pushback against like Apple's software stores on there. So like you can't submit certain content, like adult content or violent content and stuff like that. And this in a way is doing the same thing. Now we haven't seen something that's necessarily like a violent Hatsune Miku or something like that. But there is this stipulation in place that can potentially regulate uses of the software. And there's this also a stipulation of, quote unquote, what's kind of allowed. So like you have to talk to the company if you want to do certain uses for like using characters in certain situations for commercial use. But for the most part, non-commercial use is kind of like a free reign as long as you go through Pia Pro. Now, as I said before, Hatsune Miku and the other Vocaloid software is proprietary, but because it's proprietary, a lot of fans are also trying to step away from that. And so this has been a small movement within the Vocaloid community around the software called Utau, which is basically to sing in Japanese. And it's an open source version. The only problem, though, is that we get back to the issue of cultural salience, what's popular. The fact that Krypton can create a piece of software that is so high quality and so popular means that people will use that over something like this, which is has very low popularity and the quality is not so good as well. Now in terms of social media, we're really talking about two primary websites in terms of the videos, which is Niku Niku Doga and YouTube. But when we think about the cultural aspects of these sites, Niku Niku Doga is really a siloed platform, kind of at the mercy of YouTube. It's very strong in terms of Japanese culture, and we think of Niku Niku Doga primarily as a Japanese space online. The interesting thing, though, is that the peer production movement is not just around videos, it's also kind of around the fandom. So there's a whole movement of video rankings, so people will go on Niku Niku Doga, look at all the views, and these videos are getting in the millions of views, depending on the video, in the span of like 2 or 3 weeks. And these video rankings really define the popularity of these songs. And so there's this weird discrepancy between numbers, which might not necessarily mean anything. It could just be, even though this isn't really true, it could just be one person watching the video a million times. We're not really sure, right? But there's also the actual popularity. Like, if you go into an anime convention, for example, how many people know who Hatsune Miku is, even if they don't know any of the music at all? And then there's this really interesting kind of cross-cultural relationship on YouTube, where all the videos are re-uploaded. And YouTube also has Japanese spaces that exist, but in very distinct areas and in very specific videos. So this is a comment thread, and I like the middle comment there, which is, I like how I'm the only one speaking English. And someone's like, oh yeah, I totally noticed that, that's weird. But then there's also circulation outside of the agreements that I talked about before, where if you search Wowaka, which is one of the popular producers of Hatsune Miku, there are many re-uploads to YouTube that occur, which are outside of what is really intended to be in this sharing economy. And then finally, there's this issue of cultural salience, popularity, celebrity. The ability to market Vocaloid, specifically Krypton's media mix, started going directly to musicians in things like DME magazine, which is a popular music magazine in Japan. But then it got so popular that it was able to branch out into things like video games, like Project Diva, which is here, as well as things like concerts, like the concert we had last night. But in terms of popularity, we also have to ask, what are the songs that are getting chosen in this media mix? Like, what emerges as popular? And because it's emerging in these top-down models of like professionally produced video game, professionally produced content, what are the fans being told as what is popular? Like, what is dictated in popularity? And then there's also the issue, which I'll be getting at in the next year in my next steps of research, of why do certain Vocaloids get used by certain producers? Why do fans like particular singers and songs? I thought it was really interesting in yesterday's Miku conference panel, when the question was asked who would like to hear more English Vocaloid songs, not many people at all raised their hands. And it seems like it's still a very Japanese media phenomenon, and fans really want to keep it that way. And if we look at the popularity of Vocaloid versus Hatsune Miku, you can see that the blue line, which is Vocaloid, is still wildly more popular than Hatsune Miku as a character itself. At the same time, though, it all feeds back into Miku. So as Miku grows in popularity, Vocaloid kind of is brought along with it. And there's this instance of the social construction of technology that is really interesting to look at. So, as I said before, I'm in the early stages of my research. However, as I move on through the summer and into next year, I'm going to be putting all of my research up on my website, alexlevitt.com/Vocaloid, in English and Japanese. So, if there's anyone from Japan here, Nihon kare hito ga imasu ka? No one? Okay, that's fine. But if you can't read Japanese, you can go to the website and it should be in Japanese as well. So I'm really hoping to do a lot of ethnographic components to this. Interviews and surveys with as many Vocaloid producers around the world as I can, as well as looking at online communities of fans, and then also interview the actual production companies, not just in Japan, but also in the UK and Sweden as well. So thank you very much. This is my contact info again if you want to take a quick picture of it.